Quinipium, welcome to our Knowing Nipmuc webinar series. We hope that this collection of educational webinars will allow organizations to know Nipmuc better and to facilitate greater understanding between our cultures. Thank you so much for viewing. My name is Cheryl Holly. I'm the Sun Squad, the Hassamisco Nipmuc Band, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar is a part of our Knowing Nipmuc series, which we hope will help build relationships between Nipmuc people and organizations throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. This series is funded with a grant from the Mass Cultural Council, and I see some folks here from there. Thank you for coming. Today's presentation is Centering Relationality, Working with and for Native Communities. And this is going to be presented by Aquamat Educational Initiative co-founder endawnis Spears. And she will discuss power sharing collaborations with tribal nations and the importance of centering relationality as a way to work with and for Native communities. So I'd like to say welcome to endawnis.
Thank you, Cheryl. Hi, everyone. I'm so impressed by the number of folks that are willing to spend 45 minutes with us on a Thursday afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us this afternoon. She'e endawnis Spears initiate hashkan hatsoho nishla Ojibwe people bashish chin tanisani dishiche do Choctaw and Chickasaw people dishinala. Hi everyone, I'm endawnis Spears and I'm yucca fruit strung out in a line clan from the Navajo or Dene people. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation. My maternal grandfather is from the Tangled clan. I'm born for the White Earth Ojibwe people from White Earth, Minnesota. And my paternal grandfather is from the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations in Oklahoma. And I am coming to you from the territories of my husband and our 4 children, which is the homelands and home waters of the Narragansett people in Southern Rhode Island. And like I said before, it's really wonderful to see so many people who are interested in having a conversation about how to work with tribes and tribal nations in a way that is equitable and meaningful and in a long-term scope of work. So as we go through the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit more about the work that I do with Agamout and how I'm connected with Cheryl and other folks at Hassanisco. I encourage you to ask questions in the chat at any point through the presentation. So we'll have a couple of minutes at the end for questions, but I typically like to, when I'm presenting, when it's front of mind and fresh in your minds, please do feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go through the presentation. And I'll do my best to field those and answer those, and Cheryl can help me also as we go through. As I said before, I'm an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I got my bachelor's degree, and my primary professional work has been in museum anthropology. And I worked for about 10 years at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, which is the world's largest tribally owned and operated museum. And that experience led me to co-found a small organization with 2 of my friends and colleagues there, Dr. Jason Mancini and Chris Newell, to start a consulting organization that works with primarily public humanities organizations to interrogate the way that they do work in collaboration with tribes and tribal nations and communities, but also in their interpretation of their Indigenous collections and educational programming. So we do quite a bit of work via Agamout with different institutions across primarily Southern New England. And I was also serving as the tribal community member in residence at Brown University for the past 2 years, which is how Cheryl and I connected. And I got to do that work in my capacity as TCMR under the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative there. And that has been really profound and rewarding work, and I'm always happy to talk more about that also. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And for those of you that are just now joining us, welcome. I encourage you to ask questions in the chat at any time during our conversation this afternoon. So please do feel free to ask for further clarification about anything that's mentioned. I think, sometimes there's an assumption on my end that we are all on the same page. And I think that that can be detrimental to the quality of the work that we're doing together. So please do ask any question that you have as we go through. So it's common practice, and it's really important for Indigenous scholars. I apologize, I'm coming off of a strange cold, so my voice is not as forceful as I would like it to be. And I do have a cough drop, so I'll do my best to articulate and enunciate the best I can. But please do feel free to ask questions if I'm not enunciating well. So it's common practice for Indigenous scholars to state their own positionality to the work that they do. This is an intentional choice to illustrate that there is no such thing as like objective academic work or objective, one could argue objective work, right? We are human beings, and each of us have a set of narratives and ways of understanding the world and positionality that we bring to any of the work that we do. So for many of our Native scholars, it's really important for us to state our own positionality to the subject matter that we work with. And so for me personally, that includes talking about my own positionality to this particular region. I am from Central Arizona. I was born and raised there. I've lived here in the Northeast for almost 17 years now. And so while I have a very great fondness and love and connection to this place, it is not my homeland. My ancestors are not buried here. I am a guest here. And it's really important for me to behave and model what proper guest behavior looks like for others as well. I do have 4 children who are enrolled citizens of the Narragansett Indian tribe. And this is them, all in cradle board when they were at cradle board age. And so a lot of my work is really informed by my own relationship and kinship ties via marriage to the Narragansett community here in Southern Rhode Island. And it informs a lot of the work and my understanding of this particular corner of Turtle Island. It informs it quite a bit. It's actually very foundational for my understanding of this particular region. So while some of the things that I'll be talking about here might be useful and applicable here in the Northeast, it's with an understanding that that my position here is speaking as a guest in someone else's home. I typically, and whenever Agamout is presenting, my apologies if you've been to other Agamout presentations, we typically spend quite a bit of time talking about terminology because it is so foundational to the way that we want to do this work, in the sense that you are in conversation and in collaboration with tribal people. And so you should have an understanding of the nuance that's associated with every term that we have in the English language for Native people. I don't want to stay on this particular slide too long, but I would love to touch on it a bit just in case there are questions about terminology. And I often find that this is something that people have a lot of questions about. Of course, there are so many other levels of nuance that we can go into, but I just wanted to kind of start with some very basic understandings of how we use terminology for Native people in the English language. So starting with the terms Native American and American Indian, these are umbrella terms, catch-all terms. They are applicable to the 574 federally recognized tribes and numerous state recognized tribes and descendant lineal communities that exist in the United States today. So these are the most common that you'll hear being used. However, they are kind of have fallen a bit out of fashion. And you will find that Most people, Native scholars today, and myself included, tend to use terms like Native people or Native peoples or Indigenous people or Indigenous peoples with the S. The pluralization is an indication that we are talking about hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, cosmologies, histories, and understandings of the world and ways of organizing knowledge. So the S is very intentional for those that choose to use it as an indicator that we're not talking about one monolithic culture. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, that exist and have existed and continue to exist in the United States today. One thing that I always point out here is that a lot of my own kind of orientation to these terms was brought to the forefront when I started to have children. It really mattered very little to me what people called me in the English language, because that is always secondary to the terms and our identities that we utilize in our own languages. But when my daughter, who's our oldest child, was preparing to go to elementary school, I had to equip her with terminology that she could use to self-identify that non-Native people would have to understand. And so at that point, I kind of had to think really deeply about what kind of language I was comfortable with my children to use to self-identify to non-Native people. And thankfully, we live in Southern Rhode Island. So if they say that they're Narragansett, most people will understand what that is. But beyond this particular corner of Rhode Island, very few people will understand what that means. And so I was very uncomfortable and continue to be very uncomfortable with having my children identify with anything that has the word American in it or America. And so those particular terms of Native people or Indigenous people are the ones that I use the most. It's what I model for my own children when I'm in conversation with non-Native people. And it's the type of terminology that I'm comfortable with them using. Native American or American Indian, because it has the term America in it, to me as a mother is diminishing to my children's own traditional kinship systems and understandings of who they are, which predate the idea of America by thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So any kind of inclusion of the term America is riddled with power dynamics and histories that are still quite present and shape the experiences of Native people today. The terms Native American and American Indian are not offensive terms. So if someone uses them, I would not take offense. And I think many Native people in this room would agree with that. But I do call out this particular example to shed some light on how these terms that we may take for granted are oftentimes indicators of power and the power to name. Does anyone have any questions here? All right, seeing none. The term Indian is a legal term. And so anytime that the United States government is crafting any kind of policy or legislation about Native people, they will use the term Indian. Although inaccurate, it is a term that was outlined in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence, and the federal government has set a precedent with its use for this particular term and has continued to use it. And so it's interesting because Agamau, which is our small organization, we quite often will collaborate and work with classroom educators, and we will have to make it clear to the classroom educators that we work with the teachers that the term Indian is inappropriate to use when talking about Native people and Indigenous people in the United States. However, it is also included in federal Indian policy. So anytime they are quoting or talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act, or any kind of federal Indian policy, the Indian Reorganization Act, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, any kind of association with the federal government includes this inaccurate term. So it puts teachers kind of in this position where they have to articulate that the federal government uses an inaccurate term. And these are the titles that we use when we're referring to them, but it's not accurate in our day-to-day kind of conversation or language about Native people. Of course, these are all terms in the English language, so they are all going to be different degrees of wrong. None of them are right. The most accurate terms that you can use for a group of Indigenous people, a tribe or a tribal nation, is the term that they use for themselves. And oftentimes, I should say this, oftentimes the terms that we use for tribes today are some kind of mispronunciation of the tribe's own word for themselves in their own languages. Or worse yet, their enemies' words for them in their own languages. So again, all of this is just to kind of shed light on how complicated and nuanced things like the name for a tribal nation are in our contemporary existence in the United States. Oh, great. I'm glad that this is, I know that this seems quite elementary, but I think having the space and the time to kind of have a conversation about terminology, we have found to be very helpful. So I'm glad to hear that. And please do feel free to ask any questions as we go through. So given this kind of terminology, now you'll kind of understand why I use some of the terms that I do throughout the rest of this presentation. And you can begin to think about the nuance that's implied within our terms in the English language for Native people. This particular presentation is about relationality and using relationality to understand how to work with and for Indigenous communities. I took this idea of relationality from the 5 R's of Indigenous research, they were originally 4 as set out by Kirkness and Barnhart. And then later Rastool added the 5th, which is relationships or relationality. And these are 5 particular concepts or guiding values that can be useful in any kind of work, really, but especially work with tribal communities and with Native people. Having these baked into or inherent within the work that you're doing will help make sure that there is equitable power sharing and conversations that are meaningful and relevant to Native people themselves. And we'll get a little bit more into the specifics in just a moment, but this is a framework that I have found to be particularly helpful in some of the projects that I've worked in, and I recommend reading a bit more from all 3 of these authors about the 5 R's. I can go through all 5. I think the ones that are kind of the most important, obviously, to me are about cultivating and maintaining relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, with tribal nations that are not transactional in nature, but are reciprocal and also are relevant to the tribes themselves. So tribal communities oftentimes will be asking a different set of questions than someone who is living outside of and completely apart from the tribal community and culture. And so it's important that we are able to have conversations that are informed by the things that tribal nations and tribal leadership find to be the most relevant and important to them and their own questions and goals. So just some broad things that are helpful in kind of orienting potential work with and for tribal communities. The first is to consistently learn more. And so by virtue of the fact that you are in this presentation now and that you have attended the other presentations in this series is an indicator that you are seeking to learn more about the homelands and home waters of the tribal nations where you live and work. So taking on kind of the onus of doing the ongoing educational work to better inform your conversations and potential collaborations with Native people and tribal communities is an important first step. Keeping in mind that the national trend is that 70% of Native people do not live on reservations. So understanding that tribal populations are in and amongst and with you in the work that you do. I think that, you know, depending on region, demographics, and how population is spread out or not spread out is a big indicator in kind of variation. But here in the Northeast, we have tribal populations that are living in and around urban areas and in small towns. I mean, they really are dispersed quite consistently throughout the southern part of the Northeast. Keeping in mind that Indian country is very complex. It's a complex landscape of ideas and opinions where people will often disagree. No single voice can speak for a community or a collection of communities, and we will get into which voices are more have more legitimacy than others in just a moment. But just an understanding that the same as any other population of human beings, that the same is true for Native people, and there is always a variation in understandings within tribal communities. Also, what needs to be said is that Native communities have always adapted and progressed in knowledge and technology. Absorbing new knowledge or realities does not diminish the authenticity of a culture as it changes. You know, one of the red flags for me when I am working with someone who maybe has never worked with Native people or tribal communities in the past is the A word, is authenticity. Like the use of the term authentic is an implication that there is an inauthentic. And I think that kind of having the opportunities to suss out and have conversations about movement away from these dichotomous realities, especially for Native people who are so often cast as either authentic or inauthentic, or cast as being in the past constantly and having to kind of reaffirm their own identity in the present. I think that these kinds of learning opportunities and conversations about this are really important, especially if you're going to move forward in doing work with Native people. Are there any questions here? And Cheryl, always feel free to flag me if you have anything to add. I'm happy to have you add as well. So what does centering relationality look like? It means it's potentially building meaningful relationships with tribal nations or Indigenous people. So this includes active and continued understanding of appropriate cultural and political authorities and roles within a tribal community. So familiarizing yourself with who are political leadership that is the mandated or duly elected political leadership, who are the cultural leaders within a particular community or tribal nation. Those are things that may be as simple as looking at a website, at a tribal nation's website, and seeing who is the governing leadership. Or it may be a years-long process of understanding and learning the networks of kinship that exist within tribal nations and learning who are the trusted cultural leaders within those communities. So this particular first bullet is really something that can vary from tribe to tribe, but it requires the time and the consistent work to understand who leaders are, especially those that are condoned by the tribal communities themselves. Yes, Cheryl.
So I did want to say that here in Massachusetts, we tend to recommend that organizations that are new to working with Indigenous communities contact the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs to find out who it is they should speak to. Because many times we see that people are representing Nipmuc and we don't know anything about it, and they've, initiated protests and stuff like that. And, we as a community, we don't know anything about it. We don't want to take responsibility for people that are not part of our tribe. So we recommend that you go to the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs and ask them who it is that you should speak to. And then one more, this initiating relationship prior to a project is outlined and defined. So that happens a lot to us. People have, they're meeting their diversity, equity, inclusion goals, and they have this great project that they want to do, and they want us to do it too. And it may not be what we want. It may not be what's best for our community. It may not even be something in our timeline that we have the capacity to help with. And sometimes organizations get kind of upset about that, and then they'll just go on to somebody else as long as they can check that box. And I think that those DEI box were not really meant to just be some sort of transactional thing. I think that you're really meant to work those things, to work diversity, to work equity, to work inclusion. And that does not include taking what you want and trying to force it on another group of people. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. No, thank you, Cheryl. Yes, that goes back to the relevancy, right? I mean, things that you imagine to be relevant to a tribal community does not mean that they are. And so seeking out that input, even before you have a project idea, is really important. Seeking out how to start relationships without a transaction in mind is important as well. It's also a reality that many of our tribal communities, tribal nations, whether you're federally or state recognized, have limited capacity and resources. And so understanding that sometimes a potential collaboration may have to wait years, and being able to have the flexibility to adjust those timelines to fit the needs of the tribal community as opposed to your own organization are really important, like pragmatic things that you can communicate to your leadership and across your organization as potential best practices. Understanding that anytime you are collaborating with a tribal citizen who is a community recognized political or cultural leader has a particular expertise in a particular field, and you would want to compensate them adequately for their time and their expertise the same way you would any other academic scholar. Also having an understanding of what we're talking about, power is the invisible element within many of these conversations that we're having. And so understanding the power dynamics of what it means to have meetings only in one particular place, and not being willing to move into, when invited in, to Indigenous spaces to do that work, also are really meaningful and important shifts that can help to strengthen collaborative ties. Are there any other questions here before we move on? So it's really important to understand the roles within tribal communities that exist, and understanding who is doing what and when and where and how can be really helpful in your strategic outreach to work with tribal communities, and can heavily influence your, like we said before, your timelines around potential collaborations. most tribal communities, federally and state recognized tribal communities, will have some kind of elders council or youth council. These are usually parts of a tribal community that are highly respected because of their particular perspective and understandings in life. And so these are really important touch points within the communities to be aware of. Understanding that anything having to do with history and place can be officially conferred with a tribal historic preservation office or officer. Also, many of our tribal nations here in the Northeast will have tribally owned and operated cultural centers or potential archives. And that is also another important touch point. Understanding the political landscape of tribal nations in the Northeast is, I would say, it's integral to the work that you're doing to inform yourself on who are the duly elected governing officials within a tribal nation, understanding what their political governance structures look like. So oftentimes there is kind of a executive branch of sorts. Sorry to put it in these terms, it's very diminishing because of a history of the United States imposing United States style governance on tribal nations. So I am using terminology that is problematic to its core, but is one that helps many people understand how tribal governments are required to function in the present day. Oftentimes there is some sort of a chairperson, a president, a governor, a chief sachem, a sunsqua, some kind of elected official who has a particular avenue of political power within the tribal nation. They often seek counsel and work in partnership with a legislative style group, often referred to as tribal council. Although every tribe has its own terminology that it uses for each of these. Some tribes don't have a tribal council, they have trustees. So it really is up to you to learn the terminology that is specific to each tribal nation because it varies from one to another. So I would encourage you to learn about the election cycles and the electoral process of the tribal nations around you because they are ongoing and can also affect the interest of potential collaboration. There are also community groups, organizations, institutes that are made up of tribal citizens. So they're not under the umbrella of the tribal governments. They're not a tribally owned and operated organization, but they are made up of citizens of a tribe that operate not for profits. They operate museums, they operate consulting organizations like my own, which are not under the umbrella of the governing of a particular governing tribal nation, but are owned and operated by tribal citizens themselves. Understand that there is a distinct nature of a governmental or bureaucratic part of being a Native person in the United States today that is heavily tied to the systems of governance, both within our tribal nations, but also in our own relationships with the state and federal government. So there's kind of a bureaucratic element to Indigenous experiences in the United States. And there is a cultural aspect as well, one that predates the governmental and bureaucratic experiences of Native people that are grounded in place and relational ties to our plant and animal relatives, and that are older, and I would argue more sustainable and better than the government and bureaucratic portions of our lived experiences. So just understanding that these two kind of function sometimes counter to one another, sometimes with one another. They can be very distinct and they can be overlapping. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna make sure that I can give you an example. Let me cough and take a sip of water. Hold on just a moment, and I will give you an example of kind of these two overlapping but distinct experiences. Hold on just a moment. Okay, thank you. So here in our household, as I mentioned before, we have my husband and I have 4 children, and they are all enrolled citizens of the Narragansett Indian tribe. So on paper, they have the paper documentation to prove that they are Narragansett. And so we refer to them as citizens of the Narragansett Indian tribe. So in our household, we have 4 children and my husband who are all enrolled citizens of the Narragansett Indian tribe. So in kind of a governance sense, that is where their political ties are to this particular tribal nation. Yet, for many tribal nations across the country and here in the Northeast as well, Native people here, the Algonquin-speaking people here in the Northeast, were traditionally matrilineal people, which means they trace lineage through women. And so if you have a family or a familial group or clan, it would go down through the women. And the same is true for my own tribe from the Southwest. We also trace lineage through women. So my clan is Hashkan Hetzoho. So I have 4 children in this household that are Hashkan Hetzoho. So we have 5 of us that are from the same clan. That's me and my 4 children. And we also have 5 that are enrolled citizens of the Narragansett Indian tribe. That is my husband and our 4 children. So when we talk about these kind of competing systems that have to coexist, the clan system, which for us as Navajo people, we believe started at the beginning of time and was created when our first woman was created and our clan system was set out at that time. It has a holy and sacred element to it. It also ties us to our plant relatives, the yucca plant. And so there's all of these kinds of powers imbued in our clan system. And yet my children have to prove to the federal government that they are who they say they are. And so they have to be enrolled within one of the tribal nations that their parents would outline for them. So you can't be enrolled in more than one tribal nation. So we live in Rhode Island. It made the most sense for our children to be enrolled as Narragansett. So there is these distinct parts of the experiences of many Native people that include systems that were started at the beginning of time around kinship, and others that require a paper trail and a bureaucratic element to prove who we are. So I use that example quite often to show that there is this understanding of kind of distinct ways of tracing lineage and identity. Do any of you have any questions here?
I do. Thank you so much. You mentioned the term clan. Is that also a government structure?
Thank you for asking that. No, absolutely not. So the federal government, and including even the Navajo Nation, so even our tribal nation, does not have any interest or does not really have any interest in tracking what clan people are. The clan system and the clan systems that Native people utilize today are predate colonization and predate contact with with Europeans. So these are thousands, if not tens of thousands of years old lineage systems that exist that tribal people still adhere to varying degrees in different parts of the country. So I use that particular example to show that we have kinship systems that are older than tribal enrollment, if that makes any sense.
Makes total sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. So we are almost at time. I timed myself earlier to make sure we would sit right at about 45 minutes, but we do have some time for any other questions about anything I presented here. I'd be happy to answer questions. And I know Cheryl, also having her knowledge in the room, and other Native people to also comment and be happy to answer questions. And thank you so much for your attention. I am still at Brown, but I'm providing my Gmail here. If anyone wanted to follow up via email, I'm happy to do that as well.
I have a question. I'm just wondering if anyone, if any of the folks from organizations here have tried to establish relationships with tribes in the Northeast, or let's just say Southern New England, and did it go well, or if you can say that?
And
Emily has her hand up.
Cheryl, even, yes, I will get to Emily, and I do see your hand, Emily. Cheryl, even in like, you know, there is a level of tribal competency that I think is really important for all organizations that are located on Indigenous land, which is all of them. So I think that, you know, a baseline tribal competency of understanding, you know, what we mean by some of the terminology we talked about here, but also even myself, I'm learning how to also not use these colonial terms like New England. This idea that place names have always been named these colonial terms is problematic. And I think that we can have the conversation around like how to problematize or highlight or scrutinize some of the place names and the terms that we use. And I'm glad you brought up New England. I've been doing my best to not use that term, but I still do. And I think we can, again, it is about having the conversation about it. That's just as important as whether we use the term or not. So thank you, Cheryl, for bringing that up. And Emily, did you have a question?
I did, but I want to make sure there's space for Cheryl's question. My organization has worked with the tribe, but I wasn't prepared to share. I can share, but my question was different. So I don't know, Cheryl, if there's more, if we could make more space for your question, I can do that too.
No, go ahead, Emily. That's fine.
Thank you. Yeah, so I work with Harvard Forest, and so Harvard Forest does work with the Nipmuc tribe, and it does go very well. We've learned quite a bit, a lot of what we've learned on the slides here today. It's hard working with grants and deadlines, and pushing back on foundations has been something that we are trying to do a lot as well, just to make space for that relationship building. My question was more in relation to what I do in my free time. I am associated with our town of Deerfield. The Open Space and Recreation Committee is looking at parcels to protect from development. And I am really trying to push the organization to partner with the tribe, or at least be in relationship and communication with the tribe on, and I use the term tribe poorly here, because I think the area that we often look at is maybe the Pocumtuck homelands and not the Nipmuc homelands. And I guess my question is, how do I tactfully understand the different relationships over time between the tribes, and like, how do I respect the Becumtuck, but also be in partnership with the right people if the Becumtuck aren't necessarily at the table, or maybe I'm looking in the wrong places for that tribe that's not state recognized.
That's such a good question, Emily, and I'm so happy to see that there are Nipmuc people here in the room that I can defer to, who have, I mean, I will weigh in, but I would love to invite our Nipmuc participants to speak first.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to say something before I do?
Yeah, quiet, folks. Thank you, endawnis. Yeah, so I really appreciate the presentation, and in terms of Okiteo, the organization that we have, which is Indigenous led and run. We've had some, vicissitudes and difficulties working with non-native organizations, but they're coming along in the sense that they're understanding the fundamental shift that's taking place, whereas Indigenous people and Indigenous organizations and tribes are becoming the agents of their own destiny. And so that's just an important thing I wanted to mention. It does take time. It's, we're not on the same processes as these grants and deadlines. And so it's a factor of understanding the systems and of indigeneity. But also, as far as the Becumtuck, and I know Cheryl will have something to add too, is that Nipmuc people, we are also the Becumtuck. We are their relatives. We are very close kin to them. The Nipmuc homeland itself is just in Massachusetts alone is the entire size of the state of Rhode Island. So there are many, and again, when you talked earlier about self-identify, Nipmuc is a loose term for all of our Nipmuc quote tribes within the homeland, from Wabaquasit, Hassanamisco, Wamasset, Natick, Chibunagungumag, on and on it goes, Neshoba. So the Becumtuck were part of that. I think it's important when people talk about Becumtuck, you think about Nipmuc people, because we were allies, we were relatives, we were kin, and so we are them and they are us in a sense. And so and I think especially being over here on the edge of Nipmuc homeland, some of these terms get kind of, I guess, misconstrued, because again, Nipmuc, when people hear Nipmuc, they're thinking of one distinct tribe, but it's not. It's covering a large area of people, the people of the water, the fresh water, which goes all the way past the Connecticut River and throughout this area. And a lot of the records reflect that. And so that's my understanding of it. So.
Anyone else? Well, thanks, Larry, for that. That's how we feel. So Nipmuc is more a broad term for the many groups of peoples that fall under Nipmuc. If we were patrilineal tribe, I would be on the Chibunagungumog government role, because my father's Chibunagungumog, my mother's Hassanamisco. But as far as the Becumtuck is concerned, Larry's right. They're our close cousins. The line that divides on the maps between Becumtuck and Nipmuc is not real. So people went back and forth. It's not a real line. It's not a real border. So it would depend, in answer to your question, it would depend on what they want that land for. If it was land to be used by the people, then I would suggest you contact Nipmuc government, Chibunagungumog or Hassanamisco, or both. If it's land that they just want partners to conserve, and our people wouldn't be able to use it except maybe like a cultural easement or something like that. If it's not something that's for the people, the Nipmuc people broadly, then I would say that there are several Nipmuc organizations that could help you with that. The Nipmuc, was it Nipmuc Cultural Preservation? I never get that right. NCP? I never get that right, but anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah, Fred's people, yes.
They do a lot of
yeah,
cultural easements and things like that. So that might be, and they associate with us. There are people who have their own organizations and businesses who don't associate with us in any way, and just sort of out there doing their own thing, but they don't represent Nipmuc people. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say, very poorly, is that it depends upon the intent of the Deerfield folks and how to proceed.
Thank you. So it sounds like if there's like an intent to promote or share use, like traditional uses, the Nipmuc Indian Development Council, NDIC, is a good organization to reach out to. Otherwise, is it just the tribal council?
Yeah, so Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation is owned by Hassanamisco. It's a nonprofit, and we usually use that to hold land. So you can reach out to them or to the either tribal council or MCP. It depends on what it is that they want. And then another thing here, I'm looking at Leslie's comment about how she's been slowly working to build trust, and that's like, for me, that is the most important thing. So we have a saying when we work at organizations that we want to build our relationship at the speed of trust.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's not just get your programs out there, get it all done, and then you never talk to us again for the next 15 years. We want to build those relationships at the speed of trust, because it might sound terrible, but we don't trust y'all. We just don't. You just been bashed over the head too many times. So we want to take our time. And so thank you, Leslie, for putting that comment in.
If I could just add one more thing, I think that, in terms of when you think about whether it's my organization, Okiteo, or other, like we have rematriation, we have the Nipmuc Farm School, and I want this to go to like organizations who are looking to support tribal communities, and so it all comes back to the tribe itself, right? The tribal government to the people. So we're here to support the tribe. They're here to support the tribe. The Nipmuc preservation is to support the tribe, because we wanted, like, I've been an artist my entire adult life, and going here and there, and so without a place to go to, without a place to lay my head down, a community, all that stuff that I'm doing, the singing and drumming for white people, what does it mean, right? So I need a home, I need a community to support me, to uplift me. So that's the purpose of having all this, to uplift those people coming out of the community. So when they go back, they have a home, they have a safe space. And so we're kind of like the satellite around that, providing that, in terms of the center, the nucleus is the tribe, the tribal government. And so that's where it needs to kind of go back to. And I think that was important. We heard Adonis talk about organizations putting together these beautiful crafted programs that they want us to do, and then we say, "Oh no, that's not going to work for us. That's not what we need. This is what we need." And then suddenly they're, "Oh my God, what do we do now?" And yes, it's about putting Indigenous people in the driver's seat and centering their voices to do what they need to do to support those governing communities that are trying to, lead us into a better place.
Thank you both. Yes, Cassie, Tabatne, thank you, Larry and Cheryl. I think one thing for me as an outsider to this particular region, but a Native person from another part of the continent, I think in this particular area in the Northeast, there's this tendency to not want to recognize the contemporary tribal governments that exist here, because it is this kind of devotion to a static map. And Emily, I love to see like your decolonial map in the background. Like a map is oftentimes quite static, and it records a particular kind of dynamic at a particular moment in time, and does not reflect kind of the complexity of kinship that both Cheryl and Larry talked about, in terms of how, especially here in the Northeast, tribal communities are interrelated with one another and understand their own ties to a particular space. So I think kind of taking all of that into account and understanding that our contemporary accountability and responsibility is to the tribal governments that exist here today, which also include, because of the landscape of violence and dispossession here in the Northeast, also include the descendants of some of these groups that do not have political governing entities in 2023.
Thank you.
We welcome any other questions. before we close? Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for your time and your attention and kind of formulating and thinking more about ways that practices and methodologies can better reflect the landscape where you live. And thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, endawnis, for joining us, for giving us all your wisdom and care. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Anyone else? Well, I guess we're going to close out then.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Endawnis, and thank you for watching. All videos are available at the Hatsanimisco Nipmuc Band website at www.nipmucband.org. Endawnis.